For about 4 years, I worked for a very, very successful advertising, marketing, PR agency in the healthcare space. And I remember, as if it were yesterday, the CEO of that very successful agency, matter of factly looking over, shrugging, and saying, well, you can't ever make people do what they don't want to do. And that small vignette stays with me when I think about the power of consultative selling, of brand identity, of messaging. And it's particularly relevant when we think about some of the headline news coming out of DC regarding public health. Hello and welcome to the Bald Ambition Podcast. I am your bald host, Mookie Spitz, and I'm going to be ambitious today and discuss healthcare communications in general and the current situation regarding the CDC and vaccines in particular. Now, I'm sure most of us are aware of what's been going on. Resignations, firings, a realignment, as it were, at major governmental institutions, even and especially those responsible for public health and wellness. This includes everything from the HHS to the FDA, most recently the CDC, and most Americans in one form or another are concerned, curious, excited about what's been taking place. RFK Jr. has been clear about his opinions regarding vaccination for decades. He was brought in, and now he's here, and he's doing essentially what he has promised to do. Now, what do we make of all this? It's confusing, concerning, and as I mentioned, for a swath of the American public, exciting. And that's what I'd like to focus on for a few minutes today, which is the backlash to the backlash of the backlash of many of the mandates and restrictions that came down from the government during the pandemic. And I believe this is relevant going back to the statement made so matter-of-factly by that very successful CEO. You can't make people do what they don't want to do. This is true for products, services, the government. You can't make people do what they don't want to do. And if you try to do this, whether or not you substantiate your mandate, even your guidance with data, with what we would consider hard evidence-based science, then you will inevitably alienate broad swaths of a population who will then retaliate with the opposite point of view. And that's what's been going on recently. It's what brought Trump back to power, as our political polarization tends to oscillate. And I am not taking a partisan stance here. I'm merely using it to illustrate the wild pendulum flip from one extreme to another, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden back to Donald Trump. And I'm also using it to illustrate that what we're experiencing now is a consequence of poor, if not bad, messaging from the government. Whether you are marketing a product or service or public health policy, it behooves you to be sensitive to your target audience. And as I'm stressing, throughout the pandemic, specifically, the CDC failed time and time again in their efforts to educate and empower the American public with their own capacity to understand and make decisions. And as I'm saying, the backlash to that poor messaging strategy, bad campaigning, is what we're dealing with right now. Now, I'm not saying blame the messenger. And again, I'm not being partisan. I'm merely looking at our current chaos at the CDC and other governmental institutions as a consequence of selling ideas badly. Let me be specific. Trust is integral for brand identity. If your audience, if your consumers no longer trust the integrity of what you're delivering, then that will compromise their willingness to buy into whatever it is you are selling to them. I know that Anthony Fauci has been the whipping boy of the right, but when he came out and flat out lied to the American people that masks made really no difference, he ostensibly did that because he knew that they did make a difference. There was a mask shortage, and he felt the need to lie to the American people so that healthcare workers would have the limited supply of N95s that were available at the time. Now, I'm not picking on Fauci, but that illustrates a trend that Americans interpreted as disingenuous and manipulative. When the vaccine mandates came on down from high, there was limited information provided the American people about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. Now, I am not a vaccine critic. It's quite the opposite. I believe, and the data substantiates my opinion, that vaccines have been more beneficial to the human race than any medical procedure or idea aside from clean drinking water. It's a quick Google, ChatGPT, Grok, or Claude away. 154 million people have been saved worldwide since only 1974 as a consequence of vaccine policy. Bravo. Polio, kids were paralyzed. Measles, smallpox, Hep B. The list goes on and on and on. Now, the confusion surrounding vaccines is throwing the vaccine baby out with the public health bathwater by focusing on individual incidents of side effects, deleterious impact. And here's what I'm getting at. When the US government issued the mandates for COVID, they failed to acknowledge the American public's fear of vaccines, which was already endemic. And I believe that they felt from the CDC on up and down that if they would acknowledge and focus on what would obviously be construed as statistically insignificant or relatively minuscule negative impact of vaccines, then people would cite those instances and not adhere to the mandates and guidance. I get it. But just like Fauci's disingenuous and flat out fallacious assertion that masks don't help, so paradoxically, let's make sure that our healthcare workers have them, the government's overall approach to either consciously or unconsciously obfuscating many of these side effects and negative impacts of vaccines reinforce the public's already endemic fear and apprehension about vaccines. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is there was lack of comprehensive transparency, and most significantly, a failure to emotionally acknowledge the concerns of the American people. And that resulted in an explosion of conspiracy theories, paranoia, and anti-government, anti-mandate, anti-guidance whiplash to, once again, messaging that failed the American people. And I do want to reiterate that I am super pro vaccines. I'm convinced that they are net beneficial to the human race. I feel that the COVID vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, were revolutionary science that saved the lives of tens, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people. I believe this. But many, many Americans do not. And the reason they do not is because the government had ham-fisted efforts in terms of trying to ensure that a maximal number of Americans got vaccinated, superseding common sense and common marketing, advertising, PR practices to better inspire them and motivate them to do so. At its core, when you are messaging an audience, you need to create an emotional connection, a bridge through trust, empathy, and understanding. You cannot steamroll your audience and air quote convince them with the data. When in human history has anyone ever succeeded to convince a population of one idea over another using the facts? It's never happened and likely never will. We are all creatures of emotion and passion. When you try to do that, when you shove the data down the throats of people who are emotionally reacting to justified concerns and fears, you are reinforcing the prejudice of their own ignorance and misunderstanding. And we are seeing that now in our government. RFK Jr. has his own mandate and his own belief system. And millions of Americans are on his side for, air quote, cleaning house because they feel that they have been misunderstood and manipulated. So, what am I getting with all this? Well, this podcast is dedicated to consultative selling and messaging and how we do what we do in the advertising space, in broad strokes. I've had various guests on who've been entrepreneurs, startup founders, and my focus has been on how we bring about behavioral change through connecting and communicating with our fellow humans. Now I firmly believe we are dealing with the consequences of, and I don't see this talked about enough, the US government doing a very, very poor job of consultative selling. They failed. And the evidence of their failure, demonstrably, is what is taking place now. And again, I don't mean to blame the victim here. And I don't believe for a second that folks at the CDC, at the HHS, at the FDA, in any way intended to mislead, beguile, or shove down the throats of Americans any kind of science or data that was in any way deleterious to the recipient. Quite the contrary. There was a strong, passionate, and I believe justified belief that those mandates and that guidance would be, in aggregate, good for public health. But by failing to acknowledge the risk and uncertainty of these new and largely untested vaccines, number one, by failing to empower the American people with their own decision making as to how to deal with that information, they automatically and naturally and with no surprise whatsoever succeeded in alienating tens of millions of people who would, in my opinion, otherwise be highly sympathetic to the confirmed, evidence-based reality that vaccines have been the most beneficial medical procedure since clean water. The government blew the shot. So what can we do from here? Well, the bull has been released in the China shop. Now we need to endure the very foundations of the institutions that we've created over decades and decades of so much hard work, of public servants devoting their lives, their careers to the betterment of public health in shambles. And it's only going to get worse because now, more than ever before, it's been politicized in an enormous, bombastic, and explosive kind of way. And it's all being mixed up. The purging, if you will, of our health agencies is now seen as pretty much the same process as the purging of other governmental agencies. It's the doging of public health bureaucracy. That arguably is more dangerous than anything else here. We can be terrified of the impact on vaccine policy, but the American attitude that our health institutions are as bloated and convoluted and deceptive as all the other government agencies is a huge problem, if for no other reason than our health and wellness agencies are ostensibly grounded in the science. A bureaucracy is ultimately a human endeavor, and where we do or don't put our money is de facto a matter of policy. But when science itself and the data used to support it becomes seen as no different than the ad hoc, arbitrary departments of a government, then we have super big problems. And guess what? We've got super big problems Because Americans in general, before any of this have happened, are horribly science illiterate. I know many, many intelligent, erudite, cultured people throughout the United States, and they don't know anything about science. Ask your colleague, ask your family member, look in the mirror. How many planets in the solar system? How far is the closest star? When will the sun die out? What's the origin of the universe? How many fundamental particles are there? What is quantum theory? Once again, highly educated, cultured, advanced degreed people know next to nothing about science. And I've cited astronomy, cosmology, physics as examples, but I would venture to assume it's even worse in the biological sciences. What exactly is a vaccine? What is an mRNA vaccine? And I'm not talking about the general American public. I'm talking about highly educated, cultured folks who have next to no idea. So, an even more fundamental problem than our health and wellness institutions issuing mandates and guidance to an already ignorant and misinformed American public is our educational system, which is doing, frankly, a terrible job about educating Americans about even remedial science. We complain about the lack of civics education, of history. Americans can't find Lithuania on a map, let alone Ukraine. So how do you expect them to have a geopolitical perspective about the relationship of NATO in a post-Cold War environment? If nobody knows nothing, then how do you expect them to be informed about any something? So at the root of all of this is a collective, pretty much willful ignorance of the basics of science. But that begs the question of the government taking on the responsibility and duty to educate and empower said population. And when you're mashing up an ignorant population with a dysfunctional agency, especially in terms of how they message that target audience, then the result that you get is the chaos in our government, especially regarding our public health institutions. So I just want to say again that I'm not blaming the victim. I'm merely saying that we need big changes. We need a revolution in how government communicates with the public, specifically regarding science and public health. And I could lay out a roadmap for doing it, but it would be no different than the roadmap that we as marketers and advertisers and PR people advise our clients all the time. First and foremost, understand your audience. Know what you're trying to sell them. Differentiate yourself. Highlight your benefits. And most significantly, communicate reasons to believe that choosing you will be a flattering reflection on the part of your consumers. That, more than any other aspect, has been the core of the failure of government messaging. American people have felt alienated and insulted by their own government, especially at the CDC, at the FDA, at the HHS. The communications are cryptic, confusing, mangled, selective. I'm not trying to point fingers, but the communication directors, the folks who handle that messaging, in whole or in part, have failed to the point where we have a vaccine denier heading up the HHS. How could we let this happen? Well, it almost seems inevitable in retrospect when the government has done such a ham-fisted job of being open and honest and comprehensive and convincing and empathetic in their outreach to the American people. So what could or should be done? Well, in essence, go with emotion first, data second. Acknowledge that the public still has skepticism and fear and even paranoia about vaccines. Go to where they already are in terms of some of these feelings and validate them. Don't try to disprove how they feel, because no data set in the world will succeed in changing their mind, because you don't need to change their mind because you are unable to change their heart. And if you can't change their heart, forget it. You are done. So the first thing that the government needs to do is to acknowledge and validate that there's fear. And the fear makes some sense. You're injecting a substance into the bloodstream of the population. That is a bold move. And you might be coming at it, you are coming at it with the prejudice of a history and mountains of scientific data to substantiate that the procedure is generally not only safe but beneficial. But that begs the question of the feelings of your audience. So again, number one, acknowledge the reality of that fear and validate it. Don't try to disprove it, because people will react badly. We're seeing something very similar in Trump's militarization of America's local police. The Democrats, I believe, have been doing an equally bad job of it by saying that crime is down 30%, so we don't need the military. The American public is hearing, you don't care about crime. Why do they feel this way? Because just yesterday their car got jacked. Or last year they might have been physically assaulted. Or their neighbor has been robbed. Or they have been robbed. And at the very least, millions, tens of millions of Americans feel unsafe in their own neighborhood, commuting to work, at work. American cities are particularly vulnerable to this simply because of the concentration of the population. American cities, many of them in many places, are demonstrably and emotionally unsafe. So when you tell the American people that crime is not a problem, which you are implicitly doing so to ostensibly prevent presidential overreach, your messaging is backfiring. And similarly, if you are a public health communicator and you are telling the American population that vaccines are safe and there's nothing to fear, that's like telling the American people that crime is insignificant. Statistically, crime has gone down. And logistically, it overcomplicates local policing to bring in the National Guard and Marines, not to mention everything from posse comitatus to the fears of authoritarian takeover. But that's how authoritarians take over, by playing to the unaddressed fears of a population. And this is how government organizations are taken over by conspiracy theorists, because they are playing to the fears of the American people, which are not being addressed by their institutions. So, as I'm mentioning, recommendation number 1, do not tell the American people that they should not fear vaccines, because it goes against their fear of vaccines. Acknowledge that they're scared. Be transparent and open that vaccines do not always work. Remember the breakthrough cases of COVID? That was an absolute catastrophe in messaging too. What do you mean breakthrough case? What the hell does that mean? What does a booster shot mean? I need to get my booster shot. Does that mean the first one wasn't good enough? How come I got COVID even though I got vaccinated? If I got COVID anyway, even though I got vaccinated, doesn't that mean that the vaccination doesn't work? And what about the side effects that I experienced? My whole arm was sore. I was in bed for 2 days. When the CDC was telling everyone that the vaccines are safe, don't worry about it, and I was in bed for 2 days, then you are lying to me. And if you're lying to me about something as basic as my own lived experience, then I cannot trust you for anything ever again. So, in addition to empathetically connecting with the American people about their fears and hesitancy regarding vaccines, it behooves the government to acknowledge the risk of the vaccines, the uncertainty of their efficacy on an individual basis, and to acknowledge that there have been adverse reactions which have been significant. If you bury that information, no matter how statistically insignificant it is, you're making it significant. And once again, I understand the hesitancy on the part of these health system communicators that if you highlight a 1 in a million incident, then that 1 in a million incident will be blown out of proportion and it'll prevent people from getting vaccinated. But here's the other point I want to make. And this has a broader impact on policy, which is even further out of my pay grade. But I have to go there too, which is forcing people to be vaccinated. And I know that this is controversial because public health is not an individual initiative to bring down the curve. Remember, everyone was talking about lowering the curve. You need a collective effort. And there was a strong belief on the part of health system messengers, marketers, the PR people of the government, that we have to get everyone on board. Because if there's a single kid or senior unvaccinated then it's going to jeopardize the lives of everyone around them. And I understand that. But that is more so than anything the root of the problem we're in right now, because you are mandating, you are legally forcing people to inject themselves or get injected with some chemistry they are fearful of. And once again, you could throw all the data you want at them, but I go back to what my CEO at the time said so matter-of-factly: you can't make people do what they don't want to do. You need to empower them. Now, here I'll go into politics for just a second and be transparent. I tend to be on the libertarian side of the political spectrum. And no, the Libertarian Party doesn't consist of a bunch of 12-year-old incels in a basement at their mom's house, even though libertarians in general suffer from that kind of conspiracy theory messaging. If I had an opportunity, I would love to empower and guide the libertarians to do a better job of their own messaging. But suffice to say that I fall into the libertarian camp because I believe in less government, and I think that end of the day, there's a Darwinian, naturally selective mechanism which works best in the medium to long term for most things in life. So when you mandate a policy, even an economic one, when the government overreaches in terms of trying to control markets, overreaches in terms of trying to control public health, then it backfires. And there's no more vivid an example of it backfiring than what's going on right now at the CDC. So I bring this up vis-a-vis the vaccine mandates. You have to get vaccinated if you work at this job. You have to get vaccinated if you're an American service person. You have to get vaccinated. You have to get vaccinated. This blended into your business must close, even though I know it's your livelihood. This bled into you are curfewed. You can't go out into your own city. You can't go into a park and get some fresh air. You can't take a walk by the beach. In retrospect, the absurd mandates that came down from the government, enforced by the police, enforced by employers, is part of what's precipitated the madness that we're experiencing right now. And as a libertarian, I say, if you don't want to vaccinate your child against measles, then don't. And as a public health person, you could say, well, that's going to jeopardize the other kids. Well, then vaccinate your kid for measles. And collectively, as a culture, as a country, let's deal with the consequences of personal freedom, which, if I venture to be so bold, will be relatively less impactful in a negative way than the HHS being run by a conspiratorial anti-science maniac. You see the point I'm trying to make? Which is, if you make people do what they don't want to do, not only are they not going to do what you're trying to make them do, but they're going to go out of their way to destroy anything you've created which they perceive as a threat to them doing what they want to do. And that, more than anything else, describes the second Trump administration in general and RFK running the HHS in particular. Now, is there a silver lining in some of this? And I tend to be Pollyanna about most things, AI, this mess that we're into now. And I think the silver lining can best be reflected by some of the writing and philosophy of an Austrian philosopher of science known as Feyerabend. He wrote a seminal publication called Against Method. You could Google it, check it out. And his essential precept was that whenever you structure a methodology, you de facto become self-limiting. And by that he meant that if you're pursuing science rigorously, then you're creating boundaries and systems that automatically ignore most of reality. And people who follow the scientific method will tell you that, well, that's how you do science. That's the essence of the scientific method, because you need to limit your variables. You have, your control and then your variable. And, how many endpoints can you have in a clinical trial? But Feyerabend's point of view is deep. And I think it says a lot about, for example, why fundamental physics is stalled, the travesty of string theory, why it continues to have steam after decades of being unable to even recommend an experiment that could prove it. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN found the Higgs particle. But aside from that, which they already knew existed and already estimated its mass, essentially disproved supersymmetry and every assertion made by decades of string theory. I just use that as an example in the purest of pure sciences to illustrate Feyerabend's point of view that sometimes you need to turn the chessboard over. Sometimes you need to think out of the box. And sometimes the exact opposite of what you think is truth is not a fiction, but a new kind of reality to explore to induce crisis and paradigm shift. Now, I'm not saying that RFK Jr.'s point of view or this entire chaotic mess is inherently beneficial, because it's not. I think it's been 2 steps forward and now 20 steps backward. But what I am saying from a Pollyanna point of view is when you destroy orthodoxy and when you shake things up like a government that, to William S. Burroughs' point of view, a bureaucracy that becomes like a virus just feeding off of its host, you have to acknowledge some benefits of the shakeup. And I honestly think that there's going to be benefits, and there already are, to even Musk's chainsaw rampage through the US government. It becomes too easy to dismiss everything that one president does as bad, or everything that another president does as good, depending on your tribal political affiliation. That's a very human tendency, but I think it's wrong. Most things aren't binary. They're nuanced, they're statistical, and as we've seen in quantum theory, probabilistic. So if there is, once again, a silver lining behind the madness that we're experiencing, that's this kind of shakeup. And through the lens of marketing and messaging, maybe, just maybe, the folks who run communications in the government are going to finally realize that you can't shove data down people's throats to convince them that your mandate should be followed. We need empathy, we need compassion, we need validation first and foremost, And essentially just listen to your marketing experts. There's a right and a wrong way to message the American people, and there's a right and a wrong way to message your audiences when you are advertising a product or service. And the silly but profound conclusion here is there's really no difference, because at the end of that spreadsheet, laying out your KPIs, measuring the results, you're really going about trying to induce behavioral change. And I'll end as I began, quoting the very successful CEO, matter-of-factly turning in a meeting, shrugging and sighing, well, you just can't make people do what they don't want to do. So you know what? I say, don't make them do what they don't want to do. Understand what they want to do. Jump on that bandwagon, reinforce their emotional needs and flattering reflection of themselves, and connect with them on their own terms for their own benefit, and they will reward you in droves by either buying your product or service, or in this very important case, yeah, I get it. This vaccine is actually kind of risky and it might not even work, but I guess it's like the lottery in reverse. Just buying a ticket pretty much guarantees that I'm gonna win, and there might be a really unlucky result on the part of the one ticket that happens to unfortunately get chosen from the millions, for example. So I hope you enjoyed this rant. I had to let it out given today's news, and I find it fascinating to think about these things through the lens of marketing, advertising, PR, branding, positioning, and the very important job that we have to bring about behavioral change in a way that actually works. Thanks for listening. More to come.